Jewish, I don't know.
That's right.
I don't know if many people have this determination.
Yeah.
When she knows that she's Jewish and she just can't prove it.
That's right.
It's amazing.
It's an amazing, it really is an amazing thing.
How a strong a personality must she be? What determination is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Yes, because we take it for granted. I never think much about it. I'm not interested in other religion. I don't look outside Judaism. I'm okay with that, but I was born.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
I don't have to prove anything.
Yeah, and a lot of people who go through conversion talk about that and that resentment in regards to that, in that they put in so much effort, even going through the conversion process,
and you just
and
don't
they look at their Jewish
appreciate
friends
it.
and like, their Jewish friends don't have to do anything. If you want to eat pork and
Exactly.
drive on Shabbos, that's fine. But if you want to go through conversion and you do that, it's just not acceptable.
It's
So,
much more serious. It's not, you know, this is what she said. I wouldn't be ever reform.
yeah, that was interesting,
Yes.
wasn't that?
But again, a reform conversion, it's not a right. I mean, it's not accepted everywhere. And, you know, it's like if you are determined to do something, do it to the utmost of your capabilities. Do it to the end, not halfway.
Yeah.
Or you do or you don't. Yeah.
So I'm going to begin this week's.
Sorry. Before you continue, last week you were not talking, and I find one of the most important command in the Torah is to not add or subtract from it, and you never mentioned it.
Well,
I find it very
last week I believe
because we
had
can
something
always
like
argue.
last week I think had something like 57 commandments or something.
I know, but this is one.
There
it's
were
very
54
important.
things I didn't go through.
Yeah,
of which,
I know that.
Yeah.
But the thing is that human nature is to add, to
Yeah.
embellish, to change. Because if you say something, the next person will say it somehow differently.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, but this command is so strong.
Well, that commandment in fact protects Judaism. Don't add or subtract means that even if you don't find the relevance in it, it's still 100% part of the Torah. If you feel that you should evolve it, you can't. If you want to be more zealous, you can't. So this actually protects us from zealots and dreamers hijacking the religion, and it also protects us from short-term reformers, which exist throughout all of history. You know, people just make changes because based on the current reality, something is or isn't relevant. But then 100 years later, it becomes more important than ever. We can find that with many, many different things. So a good example of that is slavery. People often talk about that slavery in the Torah is just ridiculous. Why are there commandments about slavery? Either slavery is irrelevant, or how could the Torah even have laws around slavery? Like, slavery is terrible. How could you even create laws about how to treat a slave? Just abolish it completely. So some people say that the way that they look at it is that in history, 3,000 years ago, people had slaves, and the Torah was addressing that world, and therefore it has to address slavery because that's part of life. But now, if the Torah was written, it wouldn't actually do that. And I actually say that's a load of rubbish, because maybe in Australia there's no slavery, and maybe in America there's no slavery, and maybe in England there's no slavery, but there's plenty of slavery in the world. In fact, I would venture to say that in at least half the countries that exist in the UN, there is slavery. There's slavery in China. There is, and I don't mean sweatshops. I'm talking about slavery. There's slavery in China. There are Filipinos who are in Hong Kong who have no passports. They have no access to Filipino embassies or consulates, and they are owned by people. They just can't get out. That's what a slave is. If you're working in a sweatshop but you have the choice to leave, that's not slavery in the classic legal sense. A slave is a person who has no right to self-determination, and that exists in China. It exists in Russia. It exists in Arabia. It exists in most of Africa. Forget not paying minimum wage. So the world is filled with slavery today, filled with slavery. I mean, we even look at this bloke Epstein, Jeffrey Epstein, and everything that's going on there. There were girls who, I'm going to use the word allegedly because it's all in court, so hasn't been proven. But I think in this case, I'm happy to go with being a newspaper reader and passing judgment. But these girls, from what they're saying, they were slaves and that their passports were taken away from them, or they were on an island and they physically couldn't get away, and they had to do things that they were asked to do. That's slavery. So slavery is very much alive and well in the world. So for people to say, it's not relevant, actually it is relevant. It just may not be relevant in your personal life. So that law about don't subtract really protects the Torah from those sort of short-term judgments, and don't add also protects it from zealousness. So that's all last week.
By the way, there's plenty of slavery in the West as well.
Yeah.
Australia, United States, Britain, it's all there. It's just under, it's not legal, but it's there.
Yeah. So and hence my point. Very good. All right, let's begin. G'day, Michael. We're going to begin. This week's parsha is Parsha Shoftim. It's another very, very top-heavy parsha in that it's actually quite short, but it has 41 commandments in it. So it's another big parsha. I mean, if you think about this, parsha has 41 commandments. Last week, Parshas Re'eh. Last week was Parshas Re'eh, and it had 55. So just between this week and last week, what's 55 plus what was the other number that I said? 41? Is that what I said? Yeah, 41. So 55 plus 41 is 96. So just there are 613 mitzvot. Just in these two parshas, we've got like a seventh, a little more than a seventh, somewhere between a seventh and a sixth of all the mitzvot. So this is a very big parsha, but it also happens to be quite a short one. It's less than 100 verses. So again, Elizabeth, plenty of things that you're going to ask. Why didn't I discuss it? And the answer is because I just chose 3 things. But you can ask me next week, whatever you thought I missed out this week. So the first thing that I want to discuss in this week's parsha, in Parsha Shoftim, which is Deuteronomy, the book of Devarim, Perek Tes Vav, Perek Tes Zayin, chapter 16, verse 18. That's where it begins. And you might have that initial question, which is, hang on, if it's a new parsha, why does it start in the beginning of a chapter? Why not start with a new chapter? And just a little fun fact that you may not be aware of is that the chapters that you find in the Torah are not of our making. They were designed in France or Spain, I can't remember, by a Christian scholar, a monk or a priest, and he divided up the Torah according to chapters as part of the whole process of going through the Old Testament and using it to substantiate their claims of Yoshka being the Son of God and the Messiah. It is also used in context of debate with Jewish people. So, and it was also in context of how Christian scholars recorded the Torah. So the whole concept of chapters is not of our making. However, it's good, it works, so we utilize it. It's not God-given, it's not even Jewishly invented. So if you ever find why is a parsha just starting in the beginning of a chapter, that makes no sense, you're right, it doesn't make sense. But the person who assigned chapters didn't necessarily understand the Torah as well as Jewish scholars. And if Jewish scholars would have created chapters, we would have done it differently. But by and large, it's good, and therefore we use it. So that's just a random little piece of information for you. So let's get on with the beginning.
Some chapters and verses in Tanakh are different in the Jewish Bible than the Christian one.
Oh, is that right? Is that right? So they split it up further differently?
Yeah, the Tehillim are usually one verse out. And I think one of the prophets has four chapters instead of 3.
So is it that they have added content, or they've just divided everything up I mean, I know that they took content out, but is it that there's added content, or they've just used different structure?
Different numbering.
Okay, fascinating. All right, so let's start Shoftim. Thank you, Alexi, for that. So Shoftim v'shotrim titzon l'chod, this parsha starts with, you should appoint judges and police officers at the entrances of each of your cities. Now, cities is a very precise word, and the Torah actually says sha'arecha, at the gates. Now, cities is a precise word, and if we look in Rashi, already in Genesis, Rashi starts giving us an understanding of when he describes where Joseph lived, when the brothers came to visit him, he describes what is the size of a city, a village, a town. And this is something that gets discussed a number of times in Jewish commentary about what is the size of a city. And so there are two things that make cities, towns, and villages different, particularly in the biblical era. And that is, number one, the population. Number two, the number of permanent structures. So tents versus houses, civic buildings versus roaming civil servants. So in smaller towns or villages where you had maybe 5 people living there, or it could have been larger, but it was a tent city, you wouldn't necessarily have had a permanent judge living there. If you go to the Talmudic period and the Mishnaic period, more the Mishnaic period, a lot of the great sages brought in the Mishnah may have lived in central places up north or in the center of the country, and they would actually roam. They would not roam. They would travel from town to town, taking care of court cases. So you'd book your case in. It'd be like, okay, Rabbi Akiva's going to be in town from July the 1st until July the 8th, and there was a secretary who would take, who would then say, right, all the cases will be heard in front of the judge. Now, of course, if it was a larger case that requires a proper Beth Din of 3 rabbis, or a larger court of 20 plus rabbis, or even larger of 70, then you had to travel to your local courthouse. The Sanhedrin of 70 was based in Jerusalem, whereas you had these smaller courts which were which dealt with capital crimes and things like that in different parts of the country at different times. But in context of just arbitration, a single rabbi was an arbitrator. So basically, most court cases that the Torah describes were actually more like going to, in the modern era, we'd go to, what's it called? Not an arbitrator, a mediator. So you have a mediator, it's a single person who hears both cases and mediates. You can go to a rabbi for that, people do. Once you start wanting to dissect the law, and the mediator is not being trusted because one side really wants to take advantage or take something from the other side, or penalize the other side in a way that goes above the power of a mediator, then you're going to go to the different court systems. So there's a whole layer. So what the Parsha says this week is that you have to have judges. So this could be court systems or just arbitrators of the law, as well as policemen at the gates of your place. Now, obviously, if there are gates, it's a city. So anyone that's been to Israel, and I'm sure different parts of the Arab world and parts of older Europe, where there are still things like Roman, actually, I don't know if this was part of Roman culture, but I assume it was, because it was part of all those ancient cultures. If there are still original walls standing, and you do find this in Israel, less so in Jerusalem, more the older ruins of smaller towns. So you'll find that you'll have the walls, and there'll be a gate, one of the gates, the walls, and there will be next to the gate, there'd be a stone structure, which was where a judge would sit. They would literally sit at the gateway of cities, of towns. And that's where the arbitrator of the law, the judge, would preside. They were literally at the gates, and this seems to have been quite common across many cultures. So the Torah is saying that that is required. Now, what's interesting is that the Torah says that there are police and there are judges, and this is very, very important, because judges do not do policing, and police do not do judging. And I thought this would become a very interesting conversation in context of understanding the judicial system and the government system of the Torah. And then I thought this might become a very interesting discussion as to how would a biblical court, a judicial and government system be running Victoria today. Because I can tell you one thing, that the way Victoria is being run right now in context of the government and the law is not at all how the Torah would do it. I'm not saying anyone's doing a good job or a bad job. I'm here to talk about different ways of going about your business, of government. So let's just understand this. What is the role of a judge? And how does and before what is the role of the judge? How does one become a judge? So to become a judge is, when people talk about rabbis, a rabbi today is just a grand name, a grand title for someone that's done some learning. But rabbi is really, in today's era, a rabbi is a teacher. That's what it is. You don't know something, the rabbi does. So you don't know, you go to the rabbi will teach you. So generally rabbis stick to law, philosophy, etc. Now, the idea of getting a smicha, which is a qualification of being a rabbi, is just a way of knowing, is the person that you're talking to, do they actually know what they're talking about? So the smicha, the rabbinical ordination, the rabbinical certificate that rabbis receive, is as strong as the belief you have in the institution or the person that has given the smicha. So if you say, oh, you got a ordination from this particular school, that's a school with a good reputation, then I know I can trust your opinion if I'm going to come and ask you to interpret Jewish law or Jewish understanding for me. If someone just says, I'm a rabbi, says who? I say I'm a rabbi. So it's as good as your trust in that person. Now, there is the formal rabbi, more like a dayan, which is like a judge, or a communal rabbi, someone who's got what's called shimush, which is more than just ordination, but it's like they've done articles in law, or they've done, it's like studying medicine and then doing internship. And being a resident doctor. So you've studied everything, but do you know how it actually works in real life? So you can have academic rabbis, they've studied, but they don't know how to apply it into real life, because that requires a whole different level of practice and application. So you got these senior rabbis who, when I say senior, because they're just well respected, who might issue rulings on if something is kosher or not kosher if everyone's unsure. So if you came to me and said, Menachem, I just cooked meat in my milk pot, I'll tell you what the law is. But what if we're out of information? What if, like, I find a piece of meat on the street, I don't know if it's kosher or not, and I go through all the steps and I can't assess based on Jewish law whether this meat is kosher or not, but you need a ruling, then you go to a different type of rabbi to me. You go to someone who is has a different authority placed in them by the community, in that we know that they're not only learned, but they are extremely responsible, and they are very understanding, not just of the Torah, but of society's needs. And that rabbi will paskin, will give will rule on something on which there is no further information to establish the status of something. So that is a different thing to most rabbis. Most rabbis will open the book and tell you what it is. What happens if the book doesn't say? That's what a posek is. Someone who finalizes what the law should be in a particular area. That is a different type of rabbi. That is already something you need to be far more learned and far more of the world, really be able to relate in order to be able to put out a psak. I am not a posek. I'm not a authority, if you will, on things to do with law. So if someone comes to Spirit and says, Menachem, what do I do here? Most bread and butter questions are things that I either have learned or I know exactly where to go and look for the answer. It's more when someone says, I don't know what to do. It's like Hannah was talking last night. There's no paper trail. Am I Jewish or not? So I can't tell her whether she's Jewish. That's what a rabbinical judge, an authority, is going to do. So to become a rabbi requires ordination and study. And to become a judge, more specifically, requires ordination. In the days of old, smicha was that a member of the Sanhedrin, a member of the High Court, ordained someone to become a judge. So there was a continuous chain from Moses until the disbandment and the killing of the Sanhedrin, the killing by Rome. Rome literally hunted down members of the Sanhedrin and killed them, because they knew as long as these people are alive, there is a direct legal link to Moses, and no matter what Rome said, these rabbis would always hold more sway than Rome. These are influential, powerful rabbis, not necessarily charismatic, but the spiritual power vested in them was one that people listened to. So Rome knew, kill them off, and the Jewish people are rudderless. Now, they were semi-correct, but they didn't realize that we would still find people who are knowledgeable. So the concept of the original smicha was that Moses ordained Joshua, not just as a leader, but as a rabbi, and so on and so forth. And anyone who was ordained could ordain others. In fact, Rabbi Mayer, who was one of the last members of the Sanhedrin, and he was actually killed by the Romans. He was stabbed. But in his act of, before he was stabbed, literally just hours before, he ordained 2 of his students. And the Romans were looking for him because they knew that he was going to ordain people, because they knew that, that the rabbinate would not want the ordination to come to an end. And so he actually saved his 2 students by giving them smicha in the wilderness. They ran, and he gave them smicha in a ravine, which was so narrow that only one person could get through at a time. And so when the Romans discovered exactly where they were, they could only file, this Roman garrison or unit could only file one person at a time. So they were there, the 10 of them, 20 of them, out to kill Rabbi Mayer, but only one of them could face Rabbi Mayer at a time. Rabbi Mayer was an old man at the time, and he basically gave 2 of his students smicha. They ran out of one end of the ravine while he blocked the path of the Romans, and they literally stabbed him and had to kill him and eventually trample him. And as long as there was breath in his lungs, he fought back to prevent them, just to give enough time for his students to be able to get away. And indeed, they did get away. So smicha is no joke. So when the Torah says appoint a judge and police, these are great arbitrators of the law. These are very knowledgeable people. Police, on the other hand, are the ones who carry out the law. It is not a policeman's job to interpret the law. The policeman is the one who acts on behalf of the judges to enforce the law and to keep the peace. So police generally are there if they see something is wrong, go and sort it out. Now, police were not uniform people. The modern concept of policing is modern. You know, if you go to the Middle Ages in Europe, you get the concept of the sheriff or the town policeman, who was more like a judge. So in Judaism, the police was just a person that delivered the law of the judge out. So the judge was the interpreter of the law, and the policeman was the deliverer of the law. The judges belonged to the judiciary, and the judiciary was an independent body. Nobody could argue with the judiciary as to what the law was on the interpretation. Or you could argue, but you had to front up and argue with them. A king couldn't change the law, and a prophet couldn't change the law. The prophet is there to deliver the word of God. So when there was prophecy, the prophet would inspire. The prophet was like a spiritual leader and a social leader for the Jewish people. The rabbis, the court system, were the interpreters of the law of Moses. And the king was essentially a chief of police, a head of the army. The king governed the country, managed taxes, managed decorum, managed social welfare and civic projects. That was all part of the king's domain, the royal court. The rabbis were the judges. So the rabbis could prosecute a king. I mean, there are a lot of laws about when you can and can't prosecute a king, and the kings have their own sets of laws that are slightly different from civilians. But they can't say, I'm changing the constitution. The constitution is Moses and God, is the Torah that Hashem gave to Moses. And so the rabbis interpret. However, the police kind of work more for the monarch than they do for them. And so what we've got here is the sharing of power. If we had a system like that in Victoria today, with coronavirus, it would be governed in the following way. The government would not be the ones determining what we should do. The government would turn to the court, to the judiciary, and say, here's the situation. If we shut the state down, we're going to economically cripple the country, the state or the country. However, there is a virus going through and it's killing people. However, it kills these people more than that, or we don't know enough information. What should we do? And it would be the rabbis, it would be the court's decision to work out what is the hierarchy of values. Is the economy worth more than a few lives? Are a few lives worth more than everything else? Can you lock up one part of town and not the other part of town? The court would remove political correctness from the discussion. They would first understand what are the issues, rule on the issues, and then take in local sensitivities in context of, because there's no point passing a law or legislation that people can't keep. They would then take that on board, and then they'd say, this is what needs to be done. And the king would say, thank you very much. That sounds good. I've got no further complaints. That's how we're going to do it. And then the police would go and enforce that law. And so what we would have today, I doubt would be the setup, because I am not sure that there is an ethics panel that is determining what is the right way and the wrong way. And the level and further, the sensitivities that have to be factored in a democracy are not ones that would be factored in by the rabbinate. However, if we had a quasi system of where we had a modern democracy operating with a Jewish constitution, then it would be different yet again, in that the democracy would take into account different social issues and power issues in context of the constituencies and the votes, and would present that in context to the rabbinate as well, because what the court want is civil rest. They do not, the Jewish law does not like civil unrest, and therefore that would all be factored in. So it wouldn't be done like this today, because it wouldn't be done like this today because right now the interpretation of what government can do belongs to government lawyers and attorney generals, and not an independent body like the judiciary. Now, in a way, the judges of today are very much bound to the constitution, which is created by parliament. So we've got quite a different system. Now, things like the medical information, that is something, so a chief medical officer, that might actually be a government appointed role. The rabbis would consult with chief medical officer or whoever else they want to consult with in context of medicine. So in general, the judge will always want expert witnesses to inform them on the information that they don't have. So you would want rabbis who have an understanding of medicine, but they would want doctors, scientists informing them to understand what is going on, and they would constantly adapt and change as more evidence became apparent. So the way COVID's being managed today would not be the method. I think there'd be a far more pragmatic, halacha generally is far more pragmatic. It would be much closer to the concept of isolating suburbs, but also they would have a say. They would not have a say in arguing, but they'd argue the point, but not in determining, which is to what degree should a government borrow in order to finance the process of managing and looking after the country and things like that. So there'd be
Menachem,
that. Yeah.
To interrupt, could you equate Tarsus when they left and they made people leave the community and isolate, is what you just said then. They would isolate suburbs. Is when they had like leprosy or Tarsus, they would make them leave the compound.
Yeah.
Is this a similar notion you're saying, or not really the same?
So in the Torah, we do actually, it's a great question, Phil. So in the Torah, we do find concepts of infectious disease and how to deal with that. The Gemara has a number of things. In fact, concepts such as isolation, going into lockdown, these are things that are not new to the 21st century and coronavirus. These have been around, these approaches have been around for thousands of years. This is discussed in the Gemara, that when there is a virus or a disease going through town, you should stay home, open your windows, aerate them in the morning, all sorts of very, very interesting things about whose house you shouldn't go into. So there is a management of infectious disease approach. Then Saras, the idea of taking someone and sending them outside of the camp, this is more a spiritual thing, because generally Saras, although it would manifest in some sort of physical lesion and disease, they leaving the camp is on spiritual grounds, that they have to go and rehabilitate themselves spiritually before they can be reintegrated into the community. But the Torah would take a very pragmatic approach to public health. Now, interesting, in this week's parsha, there's a whole set of laws to do with protecting people's dignity. So dignity does get factored in, but public health and dignity work in very different ways to how they work in the postmodern democracy, in which there's political correctness, and so people's feelings possibly have more power than they should on how things are actually governed. That would not fly in the Jewish legal system, because there's a general legal principle in Jewish law, which is Yochid v'Rabim, Halacha Karabim, which is that when you have a minority and a majority, the law follows the majority. And based on standard logic, if something is in the best interest of a majority, even if it's not necessarily in the best interest of a minority or it offends, that doesn't actually matter. We can't govern a society by minorities. But sometimes dignity of the individual is protected. So it does depend on the situation, but we'd have a structure for how we do and don't weave that in to that. So therefore, shutting down a suburb, and people might feel, oh, I don't really like that you've shut me down, it's not fair. Halacha may say it's not about fairness. The fairness is about the mass population, not about your feelings in this moment. So I'm not saying that's what halacha would say, but what I'm saying is that if halacha deemed that, the people's feelings would not be factored in as much as they are being factored in, seemingly, in the current climate. So we would not have mass lockdowns. I think that would be different. But then there are questions about economic impact, and I was discussing, I think, with Mel. I can't remember. I was discussing no, it was with a chap, Simon. So a very interesting halachic conundrum is mental health. So mental health in Jewish law is considered the same as physical health. They're equal. So what we have is a question of as a result of the economy being shut down and people losing jobs and being locked up, there is an increase in susceptibility to suicide. But if we open things up, there is the susceptibility of getting sick with coronavirus. So which life is more important protecting? And this is very heavily discussed in halacha, because just because someone is suicidal does not mean that the whole world stops. Because if a suicide is able to be prevented by tying the person up or by over-medicating them, etc., which is a very cruel, cold way of speaking, but halacha says, well, hang on, that you can prevent. You can tie someone up, but you can't put up a shield that blocks a disease that is microscopic. And therefore, because there might be a greater vadai of the microscopic disease killing people, then the suffix of people committing suicide falls away. Or maybe it's different. Maybe it's not a definite. Not everyone that gets coronavirus dies. We can see statistically many people recovered. But we do see that every time there's an economic downturn, there is a rise in suicide. So these sorts of factors and these forms of death and the triggers that cause them would all be factored in before deciding what is the correct way for society to lock itself up or not lock itself up in context of a pandemic like this. And that is what they would take into account. That is what the rabbinate would take into account before passing law, which would then be carried out by the government, meaning the police and if need be, the king. Okay, any questions on that before we move to our next topic? Just any questions?
Well, in the biblical times, when there were plagues, they usually came from Hashem, and Moshe prayed and I told Aaron to put some incense into his thing, and Aaron went out and stopped the plague.
Yeah.
Is there anything corresponding these days?
So the plague, those are examples of plagues which, as you say, are induced by God and dealt with by God, in fact. So Hashem says, I'm going to bring a plague, goes nuts for a couple of weeks, and then Moshe says, don't do that. And Hashem says, Aaron, go and take your pan and spread the smoke and it'll all go away. So those are not at all comparable, because the Torah tells us the origin of that plague being that it's a direct consequence for a spiritual activity, and therefore the way to resolve that plague, much like Saras, is through spiritual activity. The plagues that I'm referring to and the illnesses and public health are ones which we have no indication from God that they are induced by anything. So we're talking about teva, nature, day-to-day life. But so as opposed to biblically described plagues which were linked to activities. Okay, so I want to move into the middle of the parasha, where we're going to talk about ecology, waste, and excess. Now, this can be found if we go into. So I've completely jumped over the pointing of a king, which was part of what I was talking about before. The system of government. So kings are actually, they are hereditary until they start misbehaving, in which case you can appoint a new king. So it's very, very interesting. Kings are not completely infallible. They have a lot of power, but they can be removed. So King Saul was not King David's father. He was King David's predecessor. Shmuel the prophet, Samuel says, King Saul, you did not listen to the word of God. God said, destroy Amalek. That meant men, women, children, king, and animals. And you didn't. You didn't kill the king. You didn't kill their sheep. And pretty naughty boy. And actually on the spot, Samuel takes out his sword and does what he needs to do. But he says to King Saul, unfortunately, I'm going to have to lift the crown from your head. You are no longer the king of the Jews. And the crown is passed to King David, who actually is not on great terms with King Saul. He was a general, and then he became persona non grata. So we see that a king is not a divine right. It is a role that has divinity to it. But if you muck around, you lose the crown, you lose the throne. The throne is bigger than any person, and it's bigger than any family, and we do see that. Although there are rules who can become a king and who can't become a king. So that's all in that first part of the parasha. So I want to get to there's so many good topics in this week's parasha. I want to get to wastage. So there is in the third and fourth section of the parasha. Where is it? Where is it? It's in the third. Where is it? Okay, in the section of the rights of the priests and the Levites, the Kohanim and the Leviim, and their inheritance of land, and their and things that are given to them. So people would give gifts to the Kohanim and Leviim. They would get animals, they'd get grain, and they'd get offcuts from sacrifices, or they'd get whole sacrifices. Sometimes they were eaten by the priests. So so we've got laws that relate to leftovers and things that they don't need, and how much they have to eat, and what they can do with hides and what they can't do with hides, and all sorts of things. Now, the Torah is very, very, very careful about this. The Torah, this isn't the only place in the Torah that we talk about the laws of Baltashires, of not wasting, but this is one of the things that we see a very interesting Torah attitude. Sometimes the Torah says, I'm sorry, but that is going to have to be burnt. I know it could feed the poor, but it belongs to God, burn it. Sometimes we see things that does belong to God, but you can turn it into money and you can give it to God's workers, i.e. the priests of the temple. And sometimes we have things that are going off. You know, their shelf life is, they are sacred, it's a sacred item, and the shelf life is coming to an end. You can change it into money so that the transference of its value goes into the money and away from the thing, and then that money can be used for other purposes to do with the Kohen and Levi. So we see that the Torah is quite careful about what can be, about not wasting. And generally, if something gets thrown out or burnt, it's because the Torah said you had to do it. But often you can't just do it because it's waste. So the laws of Baltashires are very, very, very interesting. Baltashires is one cannot waste. So we can understand that quite literally. Like if you have leftover food, you're not supposed to just throw it out. If you have excess material, you can't just throw it out because that's wastage. We have to repurpose things. We have to give them to charity. We have to give it to someone else. We have to reinvent it, turn it into compost. So composting, for example, is a very, very important thing, because if you have a farm or you have a garden, You can take your food waste, scraps, etc., and you can turn it into compost, and that's going to enrich your soil. You can feed things to animals. So what the Torah encourages is repurposing. Now, then we go a step further, which is wastage attitudes. So, for example, and that really starts to have an impact on ecology and the welfare of the environment. So there are two sides to the welfare of the environment. Sure, there are sets of laws that have to do with environmental things, but a lot of the damage to the environment is unintentional. So no one means to pollute in the way that we do. No one means to cause methane buildup in tips, and no one means to have carbon emissions from their car. No one means to do it. It's just what happens. But what happens is a result of lifestyle choices. So if you need to get from point A to B, you can do it in a Hummer with 8 cylinders, and it guzzles fuel just like by the liter, or you could drive a Mazda 3, which is 4 cylinders and does not go through anywhere near as much fuel. What would the choice be between a Mazda 3 and a Hummer? It's a lifestyle choice. I want to do it in style. I want to do it sitting 6 feet up in the air. I want to do it and I can drive over other cars who get in my way. Or I'm going to do it and I'll sit in traffic and I'm going to do it in a little car. You're going to get from point A to B at the same pace because it's a 50-kilometer speed limit. So it's all about style. The Torah wants us to make deliberate choices that are not going to lead to excess waste, that could lead to negative impacts, even if we didn't mean it. Now, of course, as I said in the first section, there are a lot of subjective things that need to be taken into account. People have the right to live more comfortably, according to Torah, and we have to factor that in. But at some point, it's considered waste and excess. And so the Torah has two approaches to ecology. One is on the Baltashires. So a very, very interesting angle would be paper goods. So paper goods in Australia is a big thing, but you go to America, it's out of control. So one of the things I always found fascinating between Australia and places like LA, or even more so New York, is that people in New York have rubbish collection once every second day. Once every second day, there's rubbish collection, as in the rubbish truck comes up and picks up your rubbish. And if you look at the mounds of rubbish on the sidewalk, the amount of rubbish people put out for the rubbish trucks every second day is as much as I put in my green bin once a week. Now, what is going on in a New York household that is not going on in my household? And that is the style of consumption and the disposability of things that are consumed. So paper goods, I noticed in America, paper goods are just rampant. People just use it like they've never seen a tap and a sink before. And so what happens is that ends up going to landfill. Then you've got this landfill which is filled with plastic, and the production of plastic is one thing, and then the decomposition of plastic is another thing. And what is triggering the problems of all this plastic is people's consumption. And the question is spending $5 on a packet of plates a waste of money when you could have spent $20 on ceramic plates and you wash them every day? And what is the impact on the environment? So the impact on the environment is a separate set of laws. But in context of the laws of Baltashires and wastage, there is a question about buying just for convenience. Now, if you're making you're going away, you can't travel with all the dishes, fine, then you need plastic goods. But if it's just you can't be bothered washing breakfast, lunch, and dinner, so you do on paper plates, then we've got a problem. If you're doing paper plates because you work dog hard and you're a single parent, then we don't have a problem. So it's very, very, very situational. And a lot of Baltashires comes down to individual subjective attitudes, but it is an overall principle that relates to everyone, and we must be conscious of it in how we apply it. We have to be conscious in whether we are being Baltashires if we are wasting. And so dealing with excess and waste is what this parasha is talking about. The byproduct of being more conscious about excess and waste is going to be a different environmental, ecological impact. Any questions on that?
What are the actual psukim that refer to this?
I beg your pardon?
which psukim refer to this?
So the psukim that I've been working with are the psukim of chapter 18, in context of actually the laws of truma and the portions that have been given out, and then how they do and don't get used. Now, what I've done is I've gone through commentaries on these psukim as opposed to the actual words of the pasuk. So some of the things that are learnt out of these psukim. So for our last topic for today is on the concept of lifting community morale. Now for this, I want us to come to the laws of war, which is towards the end of, the beginning of chapter 20 of Perek Chaf, which is in the middle of the 6th reading of this week's parasha. Now, what is interesting about this is that we learn a lot of social laws from the laws of war. So as I said, kings have a slightly different set of laws to regular commoners. In a time of war, there are different laws as well. Laws of kosher change, laws of Shabbos change, laws of marriage change, there are all sorts of different things. And we have to look at the pragmatics. So this is one of the things that as Jewish people who love Israel, we'd be very, very familiar with. That we never understand, for the life of me, I don't understand. Everyone says, oh, Israel did this and they're so violent, they're terrible. Did you see their enemies throw rocks and they shoot bullets? What they should do is throw rock. I don't know what they want, throw rocks back. I don't know. They did this and then they dropped a bomb. It's disproportionate. Or someone died in an attack. Excuse me, when it comes to war, it's not like two street gangs meeting up and having a punch up. A war, people get hurt, and there are laws around that. And the concept of war crime is different to the laws of city crime. So when you shoot someone in the street in the city, that's murder. If you shoot someone who's carrying a gun and wearing military fatigues and is swearing to destroy a country, that's not murder. That's war. So we have different laws for war and peace, and we have different laws as they relate to the defense of a country and not. For whatever reason, Israel is expected to adhere to basic social laws when going out to war. So I raise that because to demonstrate that there is a difference between war and peace and military and street fighting. But there are a lot of other interesting things that come out of the laws of war. So if you have just planted a vineyard, or you are newly married, or you just built a house, you are not allowed to be a part of the army. Further, if you are scared, if you are scared when you go out to fight and you express that fear to the point that you run away, that is punishable with death. And the reason is because such behavior lowers the morale of soldiers, and the low morale of soldiers is what leads to the killing of soldiers. So why does someone who just planted a vineyard or just got married or just built a house but never lived in it, why are they absolved from being a part of the military machine? The answer is because if you just spent $2 million building yourself a house and you're about to move in and the country announces we're going to war, all males above the age of 21 have to be conscripted, all you're going to think about is this is not fair. I just spent $2 million. I didn't even get to sit on the couch. Or if you just got married, it's like, I just got married. This is the first time I'm spending time with my wife. I don't want to be in war. Or if you just planted a vineyard, you're like, I just put so much effort in. I've got so much money riding on this. I don't want to be here. And these general attitudes get people killed. So what we see from here is the morale of a society is a very, very, very important thing to maintain. To the point that we have to be careful how we conduct ourselves if it's going to have an impact on other people. Now, in today's current era of COVID, it is very, very important for all of us to be aware of the impact of our words and the impacts of our behavior and how that impacts other people. This is one of the challenges of leadership. A leader in Judaism does not have the right to get up and say, I'm just grumpy today. Accept me for what I am. A leader has the moral obligation to get up, and they can feel grumpy. They can just have had a fight with their husband or wife. They could just have caught a cold. as a leader, they have the obligation to get up and smile and present the message that the country needs to hear. Of course, we're talking about provided it's truthful, but that is the role of a leader. You don't have the right to just say, I'm taking a break for a month, I'm grumpy today. You've got to do this, because if a leader gets up, so imagine Dan Andrews gets up and goes, I'm just sick of this. This is never going to go away. What's that going to do to the whole state? We'll go bananas. We'll go bananas. As long as he says, okay, this is a problem, we're going to solve it, it's a different thing. Likewise, and go a step further with all the concepts of mental health, with all the focus on mental health, positivity is required. If everyone is surrounded by negativity, then we're going to have mass depression. We're going to have all sorts of issues. And therefore, this idea of public morale is very, very important. But what we also see is that a person who instigates simcha, a person that is responsible and takes the steps to promote joy in a situation which is not joyful, is actually seen more often than not as being an incredibly special person. Now, we're not talking about lightheadedness in a time of where it's inappropriate. We're talking about joy, comedy, humor in a time that people need their morale lifted. So one of the greatest things that we can do today, and it's so funny because it's almost like you need a scientific research paper to substantiate what I'm about to say. So we know that one of the biggest things that assist with mental health is happiness and joy and laughter. So if you can get people to laugh and you can get people to have moments of happiness, it will actually help their mental well-being. We know that with cancer survivors, there's no shortage of studies that those who had a positive attitude and were upbeat had a higher rate of survival than those who were depressed. So morale of a community and the morale of an individual and morale of society is a very, very important thing to protect. A low morale can lead to death, and an up morale can lead to life. Of course, we're not talking about foolish morale. So you don't take 5 people and say, you've got it, you can go and do it, when they can't. But we're talking about within reason, because if you boost someone's confidence and raise their morale falsely that they're going to run into the face of death, then you've been an accessory. So of course we're talking about within reason here. So morale is a part of the mitzvahs of this week's parsha in the section of preparation of war. Who does go to war, who doesn't go to war, and protecting the morale of soldiers is actually the protection of the morale of a society. Any questions on that? Good.
Weren't the people who were scared told to go back home?
Yes, if you were scared, you were told to go home. But once you're on the battlefield, if you fled, then there was a capital punishment associated with that. All right, so that concludes context and meaning. Hope that brought some context and some meaning. If there are a few important take-home messages, one is help people be happier. Another is the first topic was far more academic and interesting, and the other one is just see how you can be a bit more conscious in your efforts in how you consume whatever it is that you consume in life. Ben, did you have a question?
No.
Okay, good. See you all. It's good to see
Thanks
you, Ben.
a lot.
Good to see
Thank
Phil,
you.
Alexi, Michael, Cheryl, Elizabeth, and who did I miss? And Ben. No, I think I said hello, everyone. See ya.
Thank you.